Hey guys, welcome back. It's me, Devaraj, and I wanted to pick up this series on Reichian characterology, Reichian character analysis, and we're going to start this week to get into rigid types of character. Those of you who remember number 1 and 2 in this series, they were dedicated, originally Wilhelm Reich created 5 characters, and there were some subdivisions later on and stuff like that. So I did the oral and the masochist or endurer as numbers 1 and 2. But when we get to the rigid, it's very clear that there's much more subdivision. So we'll be looking at a few different rigid characters in this series, one at a time, basically. And the reason for the subdivision, well, actually, we're going to look today at a favourite of mine, the Phallic Narcissistic male. And so this is just a male character, and something it's important to note if you're studying characterology or you're interested in characterology is that with the oral and the endurer, those are characters who the trauma has gone in very early. The shit has gone in early. The oral has had very early life disconnection from the mother often or the parents. But when I say very early, I'm talking at the outside, the first 15 to 18 months, usually before then. Likewise with the masochist or endurer, usually there's a very strong level of control or suppression of a basic child's nature very early on. In the same kind of what was known in Freudian psychology as the oral phase, which is generally, like I say, the first year or first 18 months. And when we get to the rigid personality types, then we're looking at the trauma usually coming in, the trauma or the control or whatever it is, coming in a bit later down the line, more like the age group 3 to 6. Now, something to say, as I said before in this series, is, maybe back when characterology was created, in the 20s and 30s, literally 100 years ago or so, it may have been much easier to spot which of the 5 you were in, which of you was dominant. But the reality for most people these days is that you are not solely one of these. There's different, these kind of influences come in at different times if you had them present in you, or if you just have a genetic predisposition towards that. And so, this which one am I kind of thing is not really so useful. It's just useful to see, do I have any of these traits? And then to understand when we get to the treatment kind of side of it, what can be done about it. Most people have a combination of these personalities living inside of them, and it can be very useful to understand, the roots of this aspect. I certainly have plenty of the phallic narcissistic male in me, and that is what it is. And there are, of course, things that you can do about it. But let's get back to a little bit more theory. I've got a few notes down here. So these are, they're late. The trauma comes in a bit later. Like we said, the trauma for the first 2 guys, the oral and the endurer, was in very, very early life usually. Or there could be a predisposition genetically to go there. This is coming in later, and those 2 guys are generally considered to be ego deficient characters. They lack charge, they lack what was called aggression in psychological terms. Is not a negative thing, but the capacity to go out from yourself into the world. They tend to lack that kind of energy. But when we get to later on, there's no lack of aggression in psychological terms in the phallic narcissistic male or in other rigid characters usually, but they have more like, what happened is they've got that drive to go out into the world, but it's very controlled, so they tend to have a lot of body armor, which was a term that Reich introduced for these characters essentially. So not every, some of you may have heard of body armor or armoring. Not everybody has armoring. It depends a little bit where the stage of your development, when the trauma started to come in and how you reacted to it. Because these guys, the shit came in somewhere around ages 3 to 6 to 7, something like that. They've got all their drives, they've got their ego, but they've learned to control it in a very strong way, and that shows in their musculature. It shows in their body, basically. They're armoured, they're rigid, and that's where this general categorization of rigid comes from. Okay, so those things aside, let's look at the phallic narcissistic male. The first thing to say is that what's interesting is these guys are the bedrock of Western culture. Literally for decades, particularly in the US, but also all throughout the West, but especially in the US, the culture sought to create phallic narcissistic males. as a mechanism, to keep itself strong and powerful and to keep moving forwards into the world. So, the phallic narcissist is the bedrock of the West, in terms of management of companies, in terms of the CEO, in terms of, phallic narcissists is just a way that the Western culture has perpetuated itself and kept its power going. And certainly when we consider the rise of America from the American War of Independence onwards, there's a strong reliance on the culture creating from the male the phallic narcissist. Various other commentators have mentioned this kind of thing over the years. And this is done, we'll look at the psychology in the childhood in a little while, but certain child rearing practices that become like, institutionalized in the culture systematically start to churn out phallic narcissistic males. Not solely those, but it's relied on those. So this is fascinating. And of course, a lot of the culture in terms of mass culture relates to the phallic narcissist, the James Bond movie or Jason Bourne, the idea of a strong alpha male fighting, for society, or, maybe he's had to go underground for a bit but come back up. Taken, Liam Neeson, the phallic narcissist is an absolutely core character. And, it's certainly easy to believe that actually this is the way men are supposed to be. And I think it's only in the last decade or so that child rearing practices have changed sufficiently that not quite so many phallic narcissists are being created. There are changes. Something is useful to do also before we get into symptoms, psychology, physicality and treatment like with the others, is to also contrast the phallic narcissist with the psychopath or sociopath, another personality category that we'll be looking at later on in the series, because it's very easy to mix the two up, but actually in terms of their inner world and what's gone on, they are very, very different. The phallic narcissist is not a psychopath or a sociopath. There might be those traits, but there are fundamental differences, fundamental core differences. So it's useful if you're studying mass psychology or you're interested in this stuff to recognize, well, I'll do one on the sociopath later on, or psychopath. And then you can see there really are some big differences between the phallic narcissist and the psychopath. And with regard to that, the phallic narcissists actually tend to do better. Okay. So let's look at the symptoms. In this series, we look at the classic symptoms. We look at some of the underlying psychology in the childhood. We look at how it manifests in the body. And we look at the kind of things we can do about it, treatment. Let's get to the symptoms. So what you will see, the phallic narcissist, remember these are male characters, strong need to be in control. This is very, very clear. A lot of focusing, they want to be the best, often to be the alpha, essentially. They may have an idealized vision of themselves inside, and they try to, manifest this, to really embody, to physicalize this, to be perfect, to be perfect, essentially, to be perfect. They have a strong sense of pride. They are very, very competitive. Very, very competitive. There's an extreme fear of vulnerability, and a massive fear of failure. There can be some level of attention seeking and narcissism. In fact, in some ways, the term narcissist is not perfect here. There certainly are narcissistic traits, but there are narcissistic traits in other character structures as well. If these guys come to therapy, which is not that often, we'll look at this a little bit more, then usually what you'll hear when they're talking to you or they're in a sharing circle is, they want to get rid of feelings. Feelings are a problem and they just want to get rid of them. If I could just get rid of these feelings, then I would be okay. Come on, doctor. Come on, Mr. Therapist, Mr. Psychologist. Help me get rid of my feelings. This is their kind of approach, At life, in work rather, they tend to be a bit like a rat on a treadmill, just slowly, or moving towards a path. They fire themselves up in the morning and they just go for it. It's very focused. That is how it is, They tend to have high levels of arrogance, a strong ego. And, there's usually quite a strong fear of humiliation. These are the classic symptoms of the phallic narcissist male. Let's look a little bit at the psychology. As I mentioned before, the traits tend to emerge from around the ages 3 to 6 or maybe 7. And there's different ways that the parents kind of treat the kids that cause this. Certainly originally back in the 30s and 40s, what was very, very common was that when infant sexuality emerged around the age of 2 or 3, it was strongly rebuffed, or they were humiliated for any level of touching of their genitals, for any level of expression of sexuality towards, if they're a male, towards the mother, was strongly rebuffed. They were humiliated, guilt and shame were put in. This may not always happen these days with phallic narcissists because parental techniques have changed a bit, but it could well be present. What usually is present in the phallic narcissist is the father denying affection and demanding achievement to get it, demanding that they are successful, demanding that they are the best, and giving them very little affection, very little appreciation, very little well done son, always hanging back and pushing the kids more. This is a classic American upbringing from 1920s onwards for the guys. And what this creates in the mind of the fledgling phallic narcissist is the attitude, well, ideally what it's set up to create, and it doesn't always create this, is the attitude, I'll show you, Dad, I'll show you, I'm going to get out there in the world and I'll fucking show you, I'll show you I'm a man and I'll show you I'm better than you are. And this sense of being driven. Classically, one of the parents is usually rigid, usually the dad. Psychologically, they will struggle with sudden change. They don't really want things to change too much. Let's just turn my note sheet over. What you'll also see with the phallic narcissist, let me just put this back up here, is a very strong charge in the head and the genitals, essentially. Not so much in the body, but their head is buzzing with energy and activity, and the genitals too, which it tends to create a highly sexualized inner world and a vision of the world which is very, very sexual. They're seeing women everywhere on the street. There may be fantasies about women. There's a lot of separation in their mind between love and sex. Sex is something you chase after, and you want to get sex, and love is a different kind of thing altogether. There's not much mingling there. There's not much mingling. They see themselves as the alpha male, shagging. Because there's not so much in terms of their energy dynamics in bioenergetics from Alexander Lowen, they were described as having a kind of tube-like energetic structure with a lot of energy in the head, a lot of energy in the genitals, and not much in between. And because of this, they tend to fantasize a lot about sex. They may use pornography a lot. And also, it means that the way they get pleasure from sex is more the chasing and the conquest, rather than actually the act of sex itself. Often for the phallic narcissist is not actually so pleasurable. But, they shag this one, they have sex with this one, and then they move on to the next one, and they move on to the next one. They don't really get so much pleasure from the physical aspect. Actually having sex is not so pleasurable for them. It can feel okay, and they want to ejaculate, they want to come, but it does not feel, it is not really filling them at a deep level. Their sex life is not filling them at a deep level, and so they're more focused on the pursuit and on the conquest, essentially. There may be control fantasies in sex, quite likely. When we look at their kind of vision of reality, which is something that psychologists always used to do in the early days, with the oral or with the endurer, the oral often has a kind of unreal vision of reality. They live in dreams a bit. The endurer has a realistic vision. They see the world as it is, but they believe themselves crushed and they're just trying to survive it. The phallic narcissist has a real vision and wants to get to the top and is willing to do whatever it takes, essentially. Okay, so we looked at the symptoms, we've looked at some of the, the underlying psychology in the childhood, and physically, how does the phallic narcissist appear? Often they are quite athletic in their appearance, their body symmetry may be good. They may have a good physique. They may well work out regularly, go to the gym, take quite a lot of pride in their appearance. But what you will see is strong very, very rigid muscle systems, especially the neck and especially the shoulders and upper back. Generally, a lot of armoring in the body, a lot of armoring. Their mind is very, very focused on control and being the best, and it doesn't want the body just going into all the impulses and feelings that it's got. It wants to channel that into a positive, aggressive drive. It doesn't really want to allow the full amount of feelings. They breathe, they breathe, but their breathing is shallow. They don't generally breathe right down to the belly. They can't get right down there because a lot more feelings will come if they do. And, they've developed a lot of tension around the diaphragm as well. Should stand up a little bit around here, generally. Their throat is generally quite blocked. They can't really access their belly energy and they can't really just open and express. They're very, very mind-centered. And their body is involved. They've got their body involved, but they're trying to control their body and keep it kind of from doing things that don't fit in with their vision of how they should be. That's a point that you can contrast with the psychopath. They are quite different in that. Anyway, let's not go off into that one. So we looked at the physicality. Now, treatment. Now, what can you do with a phallic narcissist, or what can you do with the side of you that's a phallic narcissist? Something to say straight away is that whereas orals and endurers are more commonly found in therapy groups, or while there's a lot of phallic narcissists out there, they tend not to go to therapy because they don't want vulnerability, and also because someone who goes to therapy is perceived as someone who's admitting they haven't really got it all right, they haven't really got it all together, they're not really doing so great, and the phallic narcissist is far more concerned generally with keeping up appearances and saying, I'm fine. Basically, I'm fine. No matter how much shit is going on in their life, that's their background tendency. But there are a couple of categories or a couple of types of phallic narcissist or things that may have gone on for them that might change that. One is they might actually be very successful. Maybe they got to be CEO, they got to be multimillionaire, they got all the stuff they want in their life, they feel actually a bit more secure, or they're curious about, okay, I've got all this stuff, but I'm still feeling kind of not so great inside. And then they might be interested to go to therapy. That's one route that you often see. Another is that they may have been driven into crisis. All the tension, all the control, all the inability and fear of vulnerability, fear of humiliation may have driven them into some kind of egoic crisis, and they finally just reach out and say, hey, I need help. I need help. So having said that, when they do come for therapy, treating the phallic narcissist is not necessarily that, it's not really that complicated. It's just that, they need initially to understand that they need to accept and allow vulnerability. For every one of the classic characteristics of a phallic narcissist is they don't want to be vulnerable. They really don't. And they have to accept that they can allow vulnerability, and then slowly work towards it, because when the denial of a certain emotion, so in this case, emotional pain, could be the capacity to cry, has been suppressed for a long time, that is kind of written into the physical structure of the body, and it's literally structured into the body. And so it's not that easy to just, there's no switch you can flick and immediately you become vulnerable. They will have to work at it. But the initial stage is that from the level of their mind, they need to accept and allow vulnerability. They also need to develop more awareness in the body itself, because they tend to be very charged at the head and in the genitals, but there's not so much going on in the body. So the belly and the heart and the throat in particular, and the heart in particular, is very, very important. If you can get the phallic narcissist to open the heart more, they start to get pleasure from sex as opposed to just chasing after women. They start to really enjoy sex. And, their whole life can change. There was a great movie, maybe you saw it, Don John. What was that guy's name? I don't remember, but it had Scarlett Johansson in it. Probably shows my phallic narcissistic tendencies, remembering the woman but not the guy. But this was a great movie. You can check it out. I don't know if it's Netflix or whatever. But that also showed this guy, a young guy, who's just out there drinking and trying to chase after women and do his thing. And he starts to change, and this is the way that a phallic narcissist can change. If they get the heart center starts to open, they start to feel more, they start to get interested more in connection, they start to get interested in who they are, and they're less busy with keeping up an appearance. In many ways, there's not actually that much wrong with phallic narcissists. It's just that the culture that they're living in keeps on pushing them towards the goal, because on some level they're being exploited. They're being exploited. For them also, whilst their body might be very strong, their legs might be strong, their back might be strong, massaging and generally palpating the muscles in some way can be very useful. To start to take out some of the rigidity and allow more feelings to come through. The legs and the belly you may be able to work on, not in the sense of going to the gym, but opening up the backs of the legs through various leg exercises, also breathing and feeling into the belly, trying to get the channel between the belly and the throat open is good. And it's also the kind of thing that the phallic narcissist will want to do, because it will give them also a stronger male side and more sense of authority and power and charisma. So it's the kind of thing they'll want to do, but it will lead them on a journey where they'll actually also start to open up the heart more, and where they'll also become much more centered and much more okay with vulnerability, with allowing the other sides of them. The fear will dissipate when there's a stronger connection between the belly and the throat. So that can be a very useful way to work with guys who are brought up in a culture of phallic narcissism, essentially. Okay, so I think that's about it for this presentation. Like I said, this is the beginning, the first character of a series on the rigids. We'll also look at the so-called hysterical female, maybe the over-masculine female, and I think there's the compulsive, the passive feminine male, not quite sure. We'll see how many of those we need to cover. A lot of the material on these character types has kind of drifted out of fashion as child techniques have changed, and also the culture's become more mind-centered, and that's applied to psychotherapy as well. But that's the phallo-narcissistic male. To sum up, the main issue really that the phallo-narcissist has is that he's brought up in a culture in which phallo-narcissists are kind of worshipped in a way and used by the culture to further its own ends, All cultures do this to some degree. They do it to some degree. So the kids are, they're systematically treated to that. They get the dads that's disconnected and is pushing them forwards. As the dads start to care more and start to get more involved in the kids' lives, of course, things change. And right now we're seeing in the world, if you're familiar with some of the dialogues going on between different generations, the baby boomers and the millennials, or the generation Zs, the baby boomers are the classic phallic narcissists for males. And of course, they're driven, they can manage things, they can take a position, they can confront situations. And the millennials and the generation Zs, as they start to come into the lower levels of the corporate world and move up, often finding it very difficult, and they seek more intrinsically cooperative structures. So we don't know where that will go, whether the corporations themselves will become more cooperative structures, or if the lack of confrontation and the lack of ability to really stand up straight and take a position will weaken the Western corporations, and they will more be taken over by different countries, corporations in different countries. Stay tuned to that one. We can see what happens. But this is it. The phallic narcissist, actually, when they want to change, they can change over a period of time. Okay, guys, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, if you're interested in characterology and bioenergetics and you want to get involved in working with this stuff on a much deeper level over time, then do check out Bioenergetics The Journey, 52-week online course that I've created, and that will take you step by step deeper into the body, into clearing all of this stuff out. Okay, feel free to like and subscribe and all that sort of thing that phallic narcissists on YouTube tell you to do, and I will see you guys later.